Today's daf is Menachos daf Ayin Tes. We will begin from the Mishnah on the bottom of daf Ayin Ches Amud Beis. So we're moving along in Perek HaToida, which discusses the halachos of the Korban Toida. And as we've seen, the Korban Toida was a type of Korban Shlomim. What was unique about the Korban Toida was two things. Number one, it came with bread. Not just bread, but 40 breads, 4 minim, 1 min chametz, 3 minim of matzah. Each min was made up of eser chalois, thus together it was 40 breads. Another thing that was unique about the Korban Toida is that it was nechal l'yom v'layla. So though the Korban Toida was a shlomim, so that by definition it's kachim kalim. Kachim kalim ordinarily is nechal l'shnei yomim v'layla achas. The Korban Toida was unique in that it was nechal l'yom v'layla. I think it's worth mentioning the Lashon HaRambam in the beginning of Perek Tes Hilchas Maisa Karbanos, just to get a little into the spirit of the Korban Toida. The Rambam is talking about the Korban Shlomim, and the Rambam says, "V'keitzad masei hashlomim asiyas kol hashlomim ki mitzvahs mitzvahs." Says the Rambam, it's a mitzvahs essay deiraisa to bring Korban Shlomim. Vehein arba minim, and the Korban Shlomim is made up of 4 minim. Ha'echad shalmei tzibor, v'hashloisha shalmei yachid. One of the 4 is a shalmei tzibor. The other 3 are shalmei yachid. What's the shalmei tzibor? Says the Rambam. That's the kifsei atzeres. There was one shalmei tzibor. It was brought on Shavuos together with the shtei alechem. It was extremely unique in that it wasn't kachim kalim like all shlomims, but rather it was kachim kedoshim. Thus it was nechal yom v'layla. It was nechal only the zikrei kahuna. Regardless, that's one of 4 types of shlomim. It's the shalmei tzibor. In addition, there were 3 types of Shalmei Yachid. Shalmei Yachid Shlosh Minim, says the Rambam. Ha'echad hu abba Shlomim b'lei lechem. The first is the classic Shlomim, and the Rambam gives examples. Gegoyin Shalmei Chagiga, V'simcha, V'zehu anikra Shlomim. And that's usually what's meant when Chazal throughout Seder Kachim use the word Shlomim. They don't usually mean the Kifsei Atzeres, which is the Shalmei Tzibor. They don't usually mean the other 2 types of Shalmei Yachid that the Rambam is going to mention in a moment, but rather they're referring to the Shlomim that's Babelei Lechem. 2 examples are the Shalmei Chagiga and the Shalmei Simcha that were brought Bizban Shaveis Mikdash HaYekayim, Sholosh Pamim Bashana, on Yontev Hasheni. The second type of Shalmei Yachid is Abon Imalechem. That's a Shlomim that came together with bread. B'neder oid nedava, V'zehu anikra toida. V'oisei halechem nikra lechem toida. The second type of shlomim, says the Rambam, is the Korban Toida. The Korban Toida comes together with lechem. It's interesting that the Rambam refers to the Korban Toida as a neder or nedava. We mentioned on Friday, Rashi and Chumash, where Rashi says, who brought the Korban Toida? Arbat tzrichem l'hoidos. We said it's a chiddush of Rabbeinu Bachya and the Shagas Aryeh that say that it's not only the v'chayil hachayim yodu chasela, but really any person that wants to give shvach v'yidot HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Rambam, when he describes the Korban Toida, he says, "V'hu ha-ba bin neder ben adava." It sounds like the Korban Toida is never b'chayva. It's never that you're mechuyev to bring a Korban Toida. Rather, it's always be'atzmusai, a neder nedava, a diak in the Rambam. Amin Ashlishi, the 3rd type of Shalmei Yachid, says the Rambam, is shlomim shemakriv hanazir b'yoyim elois. That's the shlomim that the Korban Nazir used to bring when he completed his naziros. When the Nazir completed his naziros, he brought 3 karbanos. He brought an oila, he brought a shlomim, and he brought a chatas. The shlomim that the Nazir used to bring is the 3rd type of Shalmei Yachid. The hein boim im lechem. It too came with lechem. We saw that on Shabbos is daf. V'zehu hanikra, and that's what's referred to in Shas as ayil nazir. Regardless, says the Rambam, when you talk about a Korban Shlomim, you should know there's 4 types of shlomims. There's the Shalmei Tzibor, also known as the Kifsei Atzeres, that came together with the Shtei Alechem. There's the classic Shlomim that had no lechem. It was kachim kalim. It was nechol l'shnei yom v'lay lachas. The Rambam gives 2 examples: the Shalmei Chagiga, the Shalmei Simcha. There was the Korban Toida. It was a type of Shlomim, and then there was the ayil nazir, which was also a type of Shlomim. Regardless, we're discussing, of course, the Korban Toida, which is one type of Korban Shlomims. As we'll see at the end of today's daf and really into tomorrow's daf, there are times that a Korban Toida gets treated not like a Korban Toida, but like a Korban Shlomim. And it's based on the fact that a Toida is really a Sif Katan. It's a subcategory of Shlomim, like the Rambam lays out very, very beautifully in Perek Tes Hilchas Maaseh Arkabanos. Regardless, one of the themes of Shabbos' daf was that the Korban Toida, which was made up of an animal and breads, there was a connection, a zika, so to speak, between the korban and the breads. In fact, the lachmei toida, the way that they became kadosh, was al yedei the avodah that was done in the carbon toida. So ayudei the avoida in the animal, that gave the lachmei toida the kedusha. Specifically, the Mishnah said it was the shchita satoida, it was the shchita of the carbon toida that gave the lachmei toida the kedusha, which would l'chura mean that if there was some psul in the shchita was done improperly, the lachmei toida would not have kedusha. That is the topic of the first part of today's daf. Dr. Mishnah, shachta chutz l'zmana. What happens if the shchita of the carbon toida was done chutz l'zmana, was done with a machshavas pigel, v'chutz l'mkaima, or with a machshava of chutz l'mkaima? The halacha is, even though the shchita wasn't possible, and the shchita is what gives the lachmei toida kedusha, kidesh alechem. Still, nonetheless, the lachmei toida are going to have kedusha. Shachta when it's a treifa. What happens if the shchita was done and they found that afterwards that the animal was a treifa? Loy kidesh alechem. Then the halacha is that the lechem is not going to have kedusha. And pashut pshat, the difference between the two cases, I mean, in both cases you had a shchita psula. In one case it was possible because it was chutz l'zman chutz l'mkaima. In the second case it was possible because it was nimtzas treifa. Stating that in the first part of the Mishnah kidesh alechem, in the second part of the Mishnah like kidesh alechem. The difference is because in the first part the psul happened b'shas shchita. In the second part, the psul happened before the shchita. Now, we didn't know that it was possible until after the shchita. It's hard to know an animal's a treifa sometimes until after you shech the animal. It was only nimtzas treifa afterwards. But once it was nimtzas treifa, it was a gloy milsa that this animal was a treifa meikara. In other words, one entered the azara already pasul. The other entered the azara kosher. It was just the machshava of the koyim b'shas the shchita that made the carbon pasul. There's a rule: kol she psulei b'kodesh hakodesh mekabloi. Kol she ein psulei b'kodesh ein psulei mekabloi. That rule applies to this Mishnah. And being that in the the psul happened b'kodesh, it happened in the azara, even though the carbon is pasul now. And the shchita is a shchita psula. And you need a shchita to be mekadosh the lechem. But despite the fact that the shchita is a shchita psula, still the halacha is the lechem is going to be kadosh. In the case where it was nimtzas treifa, so it was the psul happened before the animal entered the azara, that shchita is not a shchita at all. I mean that shchita is not a shchita at all. That shchita is not going to have the ability to be mekadosh alechem. In other words, the Mishnah is saying a very big chiddush, that even though the shchita of the carbon toida was mekadosh alechem, so you would think if the shchita is possible, how in the world is the lechem going to get kedusha? It's possible for a shchita psula to be mekadosh alechem. How's that possible? If it's a psul that happened in the azara, that type of psul isn't enough to say that the lechem isn't going to be kaddish. It's enough to say the shchita is not kosher. This person is going to have to bring another carbon. But at the same time, the shchita is maspik shchita in order to say that the lechem is going to be kaddish. It's only if the psul was not bakodesh that the lechem is not going to be kaddish at all. Now, what's the precedence to say such a chiddush? Very important in terms of understanding today's daf, and that is perik mizbech mekadesh. There's a whole perik in Masechta Zvachim called hamizbech mekadesh es haroiloi. What's the theme of mizbech mekadesh? You can have a carbon that's possible, and still there could be dinei haktara. Ordinarily, if a carbon's possible, there's no haktara. The first Mishnah Masechta Zvachim, kol hazvachim shenizbuchu shaloi l'shman ksherim ela shaloi olu l'bayim l'shem chayv. What does that mean? That even though the carbon is kosher, but at the same time you can't go ahead and you can't continue to do the avodas with it, because there's a concept that if a carbon is possible, you can't put it on the mizbech. There's no halachas of haktara. Stating that the Mishnah says there's an idea that the mizbech could take a dover parcel and say that as long as it's on the mizbech, you're not allowed to put it on the mizbech, but the evidence, if it went on the mizbech, in my reading, you leave it on the mizbech. But not all psulim have the halacha of imalu layerdu, that if it's possible and it goes on the mizbech, that the halacha is you can keep it on the mizbech. One of the rules that govern perak mizbech mekadesh is this rule: if it's psulei b'kodesh, if the psul happened in the azara, so then there's halacha imalu layerdu. You have the concept of mizbech mekadesh. If the psul happened before it entered the azara, such as it was nimtzas treifa, then you're going to have the halacha that even if it goes on the mizbech, it's yerdu. So you see this concept of a chiluk between psulei b'kodesh and not psulei b'kodesh as it relates to b'di'evet. Is it a good shchita or is it not a good shchita? So it's a similar idea. It's pashit whether it was shachta chutz zman chutz m'kaimai or whether it was shachta v'nimtzas treif. In all cases, the shchita is not kosher in the kosher sense. Of course, you have to bring another carbon, it's a pasul a carbon. But there is an idea that even a shchita psula can have certain halachas and kosher. You find it in the sugis of mizbech mekadesh, the b'di'evet, even though the shchita was pasul, but now that the emurim are on the mizbech, maybe the halacha is going to be a malul yerda. Here you have it too, with regards to even though the shchita was a shchita psula, but maybe the lechem will become kaddish al yedei the shchita psula. The rules are very, very similar. Where you have a halacha of malu yerdu, you can have a halacha of kiddush alechem. We have the halacha of malu yerdu, you can have the halacha of loy kiddush alechem. being that shachta chutzlas mana v'chutzlam koyim is olu lo yerdu, memela it's kiddush alechem. Being that shachta v'nimtzas treifa is olu yerdu, memela it's like kiddush alechem. Either way, shachta v'nimtzas balas mum. What happens if the shechita was done and they found that afterwards that the animal was a balas mum? Rebbe Eliezer says kiddush. The chachamim oimrim like kiddush. That's already machlokes Rebbe Eliezer and the chachamim. L'chura, at first glance, what's the difference between an animal that was nimtzas balas mum and an animal that was nimtzas treifa? In both cases, the psul happened before it entered the azar. The Gemara is going to ask the kasha shachta shalei l'shma. If the shechita happened shalei l'shma, v'chein el hameluim, v'chein shnei kivsei atzeres shachtan shalei l'shma, or other animals that come together with breads where the shechita was done shalei l'shma, like kiddush halechem. Halach is a lechem is not kaddish, and this is a very big kiddush for two reasons. Number one, shachta shalei l'shma, the halach is a malu layerdu. So if the halach is a malu layerdu, it's a psule b'kodesh. Why is it different than shachta chutzlas mana v'chutzam kaima? Shachta chutzlas mana v'chutzam kaima. The halacha is that kiddush alechem. Why should shachta shalei l'shma be any worse? And besides, we're dealing with a carbon shlamim. A shlamim shalei l'shma is always kosher. So if a shlamim shalei l'shma, bishlem a chatas and a pesach shalei l'shma, I can hear it a little bit better. But why should a shlamim shalei l'shma have the halacha of loy kiddush alechem? The answer is yesterday's daf. It's before Gemara. The Gemara says it's learned out from Xeris Akasav that a toida that's brought shalei l'shma is not a kosher toida, and as a result, the halacha is loy kiddush alechem. Zok the Gemara, Masnisa Mani. Who's the Tan of our Mishnah? Rab Meir. And the Gemara is going to bring now a long-winded brisa, and really the subject of the brisa is a machlokes Rab Meir and Rab Yehuda, how to learn the machlokes Rab Eliezer and the Chachamim that was mentioned in our Mishnah. So we don't have to chazah the machlokes Reb Eliezer and the Chachamim because the Gemara is about to do that. The time we learned to the brayso, zehakal kol shapsulei koydem shchita. Any psul in the carbon toida that happened before the shchita, like kiddush alechem. The shchita of the toida is not mekadosh alechem. Pisulei achas shchita. If the psul happened after shchita, kiddush alechem. And the brayso gives examples. The examples that our Mishnah gave. Shachta chutzas mana v'chutzam koyma kiddush alechem. Because that psul happened after it was already by kodesh, after it was already in the azara. It happened at the time of the shchita. Shachta v'nimtzas treifa. There, the psul happened before the shechita. Like kiddush alechem, the lechem is not going to be called shachta v'nimtzas balas mum. What happens if it was found to be balas mum? Again, what our Mishnah said. Rabbi Eliezer imer kiddush, Rabbi Yeshua imer loy kiddush. Divrei Rab Meir, as I held Rab Meir. So again, according to Rab Meir, if the psul was chutzas mani chutzam kaimai kiddush alechem. If the psul was nimtzas treifa, the halacha is loy kiddush alechem. If the psul was that it was nimtzas balas mum, it's a machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim. According to Rabbi Eliezer, it's kiddush. According to Rabbi Yeshua, it's like kiddush. I'm Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, I have a different version of what the machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim was. Rabbi Yeshua al shachta v'nimtzas treifa shaloi kiddush. They never argued regarding shachta v'nimtzas treifa shaloi kiddush. Rabbi Yehuda is agreeing to what Rabbi Meir said. Val chutzlas mano, he's also agreeing to what Rabbi Meir said. Kiddush, I agree. Everybody holds it's going to be kiddush alechem. Val balmum. This is where Rabbi Yehuda starts going off on his own. He says that relates to a balmum. If the shechita was done with the toy, they found afterwards it was a balmum. Everybody holds shaloi kiddush. Because at the end of the day, what's the difference if it was nimtzas balmum or if it was nimtzas treifa? There's no machlokes over there. There's no Rabbi Eliezer that says over there kiddush. Aman nechlik. What was the machlokes? Al chutzlim koimai. The machlokes was chutzlim koimish. Rabbi Eliezer says kiddush. Rabbi Yeshua says like kiddush. In other words, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir are arguing on 2 points. According to Rabbi Meir, everybody agrees chutzlas manoi and chutzlim koimai. Emphasis on chutzlim koimai is kiddush. The machlokes is if it was nimtzas balmum. According to Rabbi Eliezer, kiddush. According to Chachamim, like kiddush. According to Rabbi Yehuda, everybody agrees that if it was nimtzas balas mum, the halacha is loy kiddush, because nimtzas balas mum is like nimtzas treifa. The machlokes is chutzim kaimai. Chutzim kaimai, according to Rabbi Eliezer, is going to be kiddush. According to Chachamim, is going to be loy kiddush. Meaning, according to Rabbi Yehuda, there's a chilik, a liba the Rabbi Yeshua, a liba the Chachamim between shachta chutzlas manoi and shachta chutzim kaimai. Chutzlas manoi is kiddush, chutzim kaimai is like kiddush. Talk to Gemara. Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer said this is all in Rabbi Yehuda's version of Rabbi Eliezer. Where Rabbi Eliezer holds is a chilik between chutzlas manoi and chutzim kaimai. Chutzlas manoi is kiddush alechem, chutzim kaimai it's like kiddush alechem. However, chutzlas manoi pasol, the chutzlim kaimai pasol, ma chutzlas manoi kiddush, af chutzim kaimai kiddush. So Rabbi Eliezer said, what should be the difference between chutzlas manoi and chutzim kaimai? Rabbi Yeshua, you might the chutzlas manoi is kiddush. Why? Because it's psulei by kiddush. So how in the world could chutzim kaimai be any different? I'm Rabbi Yeshua. I'll tell you, hoyo the chutzim kaimai pasol, ubalmum pasol. Being the chutzim kaimai is pasol, balmum is pasol. Not balmum like kiddush. Af chutzim kaimai like kiddush. Because of Rabbi Yehuda's version, Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer both agree that Nimtzas Balas Mum is going to be possible. So Rabbi Yeshua said, you're right, Chutzim Kaim is possible. Bal Mum is also possible. And if Bal Mum is like Kiddush, Chutzim Kaim should be like Kiddush. I'm like Rabbi Eliezer, I need the Misay Chutzim Manay. I'm comparing it to Chutzim Manay where it's Kiddush. V'ata di Misay the Bal Mum, and you're comparing it to Bal Mum which is like Kiddush. Nir Lamidayim. Let's sit down and let's see, is Chutzim Kaim more similar to Chutzim Manay or is Chutzim Kaim more similar to Bal Mum? Im Daim Chutzim Manay. If it's more similar to Chutzim Manay than Chutzim Manay, then we'll compare it to Chutzim Manay. Im Daim Bal Mum, then we're going to compare it to Bal Mum. So again, everybody agrees Chutzlas Manay is Kiddush. If you shech the carbon toida with a machshava of Chutzlas Manay, the halach is the lechem become Kaddish. Everybody agrees, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that if they shechted the carbon toida and they found afterwards that the carbon toida was a Bal Mum, why Kiddush halachem? There's a machlokes. What about Chutzlam Kaima? If machshava not Chutzlas Manay, but Chutzlam Kaima, that's the lesser machshava spigel. Is it going to be Kiddush or is it going to be like Kiddush? Rabbi Eliezer said it's going to be Kiddush. It's like Chutzlas Manay. Rabbi Yeshua said it's going to be like Kiddush. It's going to be like Mo. So Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua are sitting down and they're going to sort this out. They're going to say, let's see, Nira, Lemi Daima. Who's it more similar to? Is it more Daima to Chutzlas Manay? Then we're going to both agree to compare it to Chutzlas Manay. If it's more Daima to Bal Mum, then we're going to compare it to Bal Mum. Hischa, Rabbi Eliezer Deladnas. Rabbi Eliezer started first. He said, Danim P'sul Machshava, P'sul Machshava. I mean, to me, it's pretty obvious. Chutzlam Kaim is more similar. Chutzlam Kaim and Chutzlas Manay come together throughout Zvachim and Menachos. In fact, the Gemara learns Hekation between the two. And they're fundamentally similar because they're both a P'sul and the Machshava. They done a P'sul Machshava. As opposed to a Bal Mum, there's something wrong physically with the animal. It's not a psul machshav, it's a psul aguf. His Rabbi Yeshua Ladum, Rabbi Yeshua said, I can hear it differently. Done psul she'ein by kares, psul she'ein by kares. Vayechiach chutzes manish, psul she'esh by kares. It's true, chutzes manish, chutzes kami have a similarity. They're both psul in the machshav. There's nothing physically wrong with the carbon, but it's all in the machshava. But at the same time, one has kares, the other doesn't have kares. I think it makes more sense to compare chutzim kaimi to Bal Mum, which also doesn't involve kares. But the Rabbi Yeshua continued, and he said, you're telling me, chutzim kaimi has to be like chutzim manay, because chutzim kaimi is a psul machshava. There's precedence in psul machshava that it's kiddush alechem. Chutzim manay. I'll show you a case at Rabbi Yeshua. We have a psul machshava and it's like kiddush alechem. The last line of the mission. Nobody argues with that. Shaloi l'shma, says the Gemara. Rabbi Eliezer heard that the second Taina, he said that Manavshach, even if you want to tell me that Chutzim Kaim is Psul Machshava, thus you're not going to compare it to Bal Mum, but at the end of the day, I can find you a Psul Machshava that's also B'loi Kiddush Alechem, the Shalsek Rabbi Eliezer came around, and Rabbi Eliezer was masking to Rabbi Yeshua. So Rabbi Yehuda's version of the Machlokes, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, there was actually a resolution, and that is Rabbi Eliezer was masking the Shitas Rabbi Yeshua. He came around and he agreed that if the Toida was brought, the shechita was done with a machshav of chuslam kaimai, the halach is going to be kiddush halechem. The halach is going to be kiddush, like kiddush halechem. Rav Neya says the Gemara, Maishna shachta v'nimtzas treifa dahavi psulei koydem shechita u'maishna shachta v'nimtzas balas mum v'lei havi koydem shechita. The obvious question. According to Rav Neya, there was a chiluk between if the shechita was done, it was nimtzas treifa, and the shechita was done, and it was nimtzas balas mum. Nimtzas treifa, we said it's not psulei koydem. Everybody agrees the halach is like kiddush halechem. Nimtzas balas mum, just the opposite. Over there it was a machlekes Rebbe Eliezer and the Chachamim. According to Rav Meir, that's the machlekes Rebbe Eliezer and the Chachamim. Where according to Rebbe Eliezer, it's going to be kiddush. So clearly, there's a svara in the world to be machalek between nimtzas treifa and nimtzas balas mum. So well, what's the difference? They're both psulei koydem shchita, and if the rule is kolshe psulei bakoydish, psulei mekabloi, but ain't psulei bakoydish, ain't psulei, then l'chura nimtzas balas mum is also not psulei bakoydish. Says the Gemara bedukin shabayim. We're talking about not an ordinary mum. We're talking about a mum that was in the ayin of the animal. Valid Rabbi Akiva. It's really based on Rabbi Akiva shita throughout Kachim, the Amar, Imolu Loyer. Rabbi Akiva shita is that if an animal has a mum bedukim shabayim, the halach is Imolu Loyer. So what? Oh, if it's Imolu Loyer, then you see that we look at it as a shchita on some level. It has a din shchita with regards to the haktar b'di'evin, like we spoke at right at the beginning of the Mishnah, that there's a parallel between this sugya of a shchita psula being mekadesh the lechem, and the sugyas and a mizbeach mekadesh, a shchita psula allowing a haktara of a malula yerdu. So being that there is a type of mum that has this haktara psula of a malula yerdu, that's the mum that Rabbi Eliezer was referring to when he said that shachta v'nimtzas balas mum, it's going to be kiddush. You're right, an ordinary mum where it's a malu yerdu, you see it's not a shchita at all, and a chanami. And such a shchita wouldn't have the ability to be mekadesh the lechem. But hacham ma'yaskinon bedukin shabai, valibad Rabbi Akiva, there's one shita who holds that type of mum is a malu yardu. If it's a malu yardu, so to the halach is in our sugya, it's going to be kiddush alechem. Rabbi Yeshua. What about Rabbi Yeshua? Rabbi Yeshua agrees to the premise. Argues the Gemara that there's a parallel between the sugya of Alu La Yerdu and this sugya right here. So if Rabbi Yeshua agrees with Rabbi Akiva Shita that Betukin Shaba'ayin it's Alu La Yerdu, and it's only then that Rabbi Eliezer said the halacha that Kiddush Alechem. Why does Rabbi Yeshua argue? Why does Rabbi Yeshua hold like Kiddush Alechem? Ki Am Rabbi Akiva Alu La Yerdu Bepsule de Gufe Aval Kiddush Alechem Lai. As much as it's true, there is a similarity between the two sugyas, but it's not the same sugya. Rabbi Akiva only meant it with regards to Alu La Yerdu. He never meant it with regards to Kiddush Alechem. Meaning in Rabbi Yeshua's world, there's three madregas. There's a shchita that's so puzzle that it does absolutely nothing. Then there's a shchita that's puzzle that can at least be mekadosh the lechem, and then there's a shchita that's puzzle that can't be mekadosh the lechem, but it could create halachas of a malu lo yerde. It mechatos sheshachta chutz lizmano. A chatos where the shchita was done chutz lizmano in also lo ytere. The halacha is a malu lo yerde. Chutzlim kaima. What if it was on chutzlim kaima? Rava amatered. Rava says im alu yerdu. Rabba amaloitered. Rabba says im alu lo yerdu. So this is a nice machlokes. Rava and Rabba. That's very negay perik mizbeach mekadosh. What does it have to do with our sugya? Because again, the theme of the first part of today's daf is that there's a similarity between the shchita of the lachmi toida and its ability to be mekadosh the lechem, and a shchita psula and its ability to create the halachas of Aktara Psula, the halacha of Imalu Lo Yerdu. So if we have a machlokes Rava and Rabba, whether there's a halacha of Imalu Yerdu, Imalu Lo Yerdu, by a chata sheshachta chutzim kaima, we may be able to trace the source of that machlokes in our sugya right here. And says the Gemara, we very easily can. Very geschmack. Rava, Rabbi Yeshua. Rava holds like Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua that holds, according to Rabbi Yehuda's version of the machlokes, Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer, that the lachmei toida sheshachton chutzlim kaima, the halacha is like kiddush halechem. That would then mean it doesn't have a din shchita at all. So as it relates to the haktaras psulim of a malu yerdu, the halacha is going to be tered. Thus Rabbi said im Allah tered. Whereas Rabbi's Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi holds like Rabbi Eliezer that says that a shchita chutzlim kaima is like a shchita chutzlim zmana. It has the ability to be mekadosh alechem. If it has the ability to be mekadosh alechem, it's also considered a shchita with regards to aktaras psulim. Thus the halacha is going to be a malu lo yerdu. It's a very geschmack. Rava that said Tered holds like Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi that says Loi Tered holds like Rabbi Eliezer. Says the Gemara, B'Hada Rabbi L'Gabi the Rav. Rabbi was chayzer. Why was he chayzer? Says the Gemara Geshmak. Midahada Be Rabbi Eliezer L'Gabi Rabbi Yeshua. Because Rabbi is really predicated Rabbi Eliezer. And the Gemara said at the end of the brayso, what happened? The shasak Rabbi Eliezer. Also, if Rabbi Eliezer was chayzer and Rabbi's shita hinges on shita's Rabbi Eliezer, then obviously Rabbi must have been chayzer as well. Some say no. Avagav Be Rabbi Eliezer L'Gabi Rabbi Yeshua. Even though Rabbi Eliezer was chayzer Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi L'Gabi the Rav L'Hada Be. Rabbi wasn't chayzer to Rava, and the Gemara says a nice svara. Because what was the reason that Rabbi Eliezer was chayzer to Rabbi Yeshua? Rabbi Yeshua was arguing that chutzim kaima should be chutzim zmanik because they're both psul machshava. Rabbi Yeshua said, I think chutzim kaima should be like Baal Mum, because they both don't have a chorus. So what did Rabbi Yeshua taina? Rabbi Yeshua says, I'm going to resolve it because I'll find you another case of a psul machshava where the halacha is like kiddush halechem. Shaloi l'shma. And it was because of that reason Rabbi Eliezer was shoysik. Taina is the Gemara, what's the halacha of a chata shaloi l'shma with regards to the halachas of Alu lo yerdu? The halacha is Alu lo yerdu. So although it's true that shaloi l'shma is like kiddush halechem, it's not a shchita with regards to being mekadosh the lechem, but at the same time it is a shchita with regards to taras psulim. So Rabbi Yeshua's checkmate taina that caused v'shas like Rabbi Eliezer is a taina in our sugya. It's not a taina in Perek HaMizbeach Mekadosh. So says the Gemara, if ikad amri af agaf the hadabe Rabbi Eliezer legabe Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi legabe the Rav lehadabe hasim would come with the shalei l'shma. Over there the argument was shalei l'shma. But hachi dainas lebe shalei l'shma. Even if you're going to compare it to shalei l'shma, what's the halacha going to be? It's going to be a mosol leiteret. Therefore, even though Rabbi Eliezer was chayzer to Rabbi Yeshua, but at the same time, Rabbi was not chayzer to Rava. Exhale. This concludes a pretty difficult Lamdish Gemara. Again, it's a sugi here, Menachos Tafayin Test, that really it mirrors, that it parallels very much a whole parak in Shas. The 9th parak in Masechtas Zvachim, one of the more difficult parakim in Shas, parak Mizbeach Mekadosh. And again, what's the takeaway from this sugya? That not all shchitas psulos were created equally. Not all avodas psulos are the same. That's an idea that features very, very prominently when you look parak Mizbeach Mekadosh. There are times where an avodah psula is such a bad avodah, such a pasul avodah, that even b'di'evet, if the imurim go on the mizbeach, there's no halacha of haktara. Imolu, you put it on the mizbeach, yerdu, even though the mizbeach could be makadesh psulim, kol hanegeh b'mizbeach yikdash, hi ha'oila, l'rabbis kol ha'oila, and it doesn't matter. It's such a bad carbon, it's so pasul, it's so rachik from kedusha that it should even have the ability for the mizbeach to be makadesh. But then you have times where you could do an avodah, the avodah could be pasul, and b'di'evet, there is a concept of a malula yerdu, which means it's a din aktar. The Briskerov learned that Imolu Yerd was a din Imolu Yerd. It's not just, all right, it's on the Mizbech, leave it there. No. It's a halach, it's a hilchas aktara. There's aktaras ksherim and there's aktaras psula. So there's an idea within avodas psulas, sometimes it's so possible, it's completely mufka from avodah, and sometimes no. Even though it's possible, and you can't do an avodah ksheira with it. It's like olubayim l'shem cheva, etc., etc. But at the same, there is an idea of aktaras psulah. There's an idea of malula yerdu. That is something that's important in the sugyas of carbon taida. Because in carbon taida, you need the shechita to be mekadesh the lechem. What about the shechita psulah? Is it mekadesh lechem? Is it not? L'may nafkamina? Is the lechem chulin or is the lechem kadesh? Do you treat it like hektish? Albeit hektish, maybe that's possible. But do you treat it like hektish, or do you treat it now like chulin? So again, it's the same sugya. Whatever would be considered a shchita with regards to him, olu lo yerdu, would be considered a shchita with regards to lo kidesh alechem. Whatever would not be considered a shchita psula with regards to olo yerdu would not be considered a shchita psula as it relates to the halachas of kidesh alechem. Some differences, but either way, that's the sugya. Now, one of the chilukim, one of the interesting things that came out from this sugya is that the way Rabbi Yehuda understood the machlekes, Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim in the Mishnah, it comes out according to the Chachamim, there's a chiluk between chutz l'zmanoi and chutz l'mkaimoi. Very interesting. That if the shechita was done with a machshav of chutz l'zmanoi, then the halach is going to be kiddush alechem. If the shechita was done with a machshav of chutz l'mkaimoi, then the halach is going to be like kiddush alechem. And this is a good trivia question because it's from the very few places really that you have in Masechtas Zvachim and Menachos a real nafkamina between a chutz l'zman and chutz l'mkaimoi. Usually the nafkamina between chutz l'zman and chutz l'mkaimoi is kares. That's the nafkamina. Is there kares or is there no kares? And here you have a sugya Menachos Tafayin Tes where there's a fundamental difference between an avodah that was done with a machshav of chutz l'zman. Again, what does that mean? To eat the basar, to be makdei murim, to do the zrika chutz l'zman and chutz l'mkaimoi, or if it was done chutz l'mkaimoi. Usually the chiluk is that both the same. They're both called pigel. One is kares, one is not kares. But you have a very big chiluk. Shachta chutz l'zman and kiddush alechem. Shachta chutz l'mkaimoi. According to Rabbi Shua, the chachamim, it's going to be like it. And the question is why? What's pashut pshat? Why should there be a difference between chutz l'zmanoi and chutz l'mkaimoi? But really, the answer is totally in the very basic lumdus that we've spoken about many times. One of the themes of Seder Kachin, one of the important fundamental principles you have to understand some of these sugyas, and that is that when you talk about pigel, there's a sprach called carbon pigel, which means the Gemara says kartzas kosher kachartzas pasul. In order for a carbon to have pigel, in the sense that if somebody eats from the basar, he's going to be chayiv kares, you'd have to do dalet avodas with this carbon pigel. And now, at first glance, dalet avodas is when you bring a kosher or carbon. So you want to reach from a carbon, you have to do shchita gabal lachas riki. You need dalet avodas in order for the carbon to be meratza. In order for a carbon to be pigel, you also have to do dalet avodas. As if to say, carbon can't just become pigel. You need dalet avodas to make it pigel. What do you mean? Dalet avodas? It's a pasul of carbon. True. But in order to have this type of psul, you'd have to do dalet avodas. Kartzas kosher, kachartzas pasul. The same dalet avodas you need to make a carbon be meratza in the kosher sense, you need in order to make this carbon meratza in the pasul sense. In order for it to be a machshavas pigel. If that's the case, every pigel really needs a shchita. It needs a Kabbalah, it needs a Halacha, it needs a Zrika. If it wasn't a Shchita, Kabbalah, Halacha, Zrika, it wouldn't be able to be pigel. That's why if there's another issue with the carbon, it never becomes pigel. Right? The only time a carbon becomes pigel is if the only problem with the carbon is the Machshav is pigel. But let's say there's another issue. You also had a Machshav Shaloi Lishma by one of the other Avodas. It's not pigel. Why not? It's a difference. I had a Machshav Chutz L'Zmanei because you need that the carbon should have Dalut Kosher Avodas. Dal mine the machshav is pigel. If there's a machshav shloi l'shma, one of the other avodas, then by definition you didn't have dal kosher avodas. So there's no way to make the carbon pigel. If that's the case, you see clearly minei ubei in the parasha of pigel that there's a chiluk between a shchita chutz l'zmani and a shchita chutz l'mkaimai. A shchita chutz l'zmani, the Torah was mechadish, is a shchita. The whole raya it's a shchita because otherwise it couldn't be pigel. You need it for the Hartzah's puzzle. So by definition, if the carbon is going to become pigel, al yedei shchita chutzas mano, it means the shchita is a shchita. So once the shchita is a shchita, it's kiddush alachem also. But by chutzam kaimen, there's no halacha of kartzah's kasha kach hartzah's puzzle. There's no chi of karas anyways. The chi of karas the halacha of kartzah's puzzle is halacha in the karas. Chutzam kaimen has no karas. So if it has no karas, you don't have this chiddush that the Torah was mechadish that the shchita is a shchita. So maybe it's going to be like Kiddush Alechem. So really the premise to understand this complicated chiluk between Chutz L'Zman and Chutz L'Kaimai regarding Toida, whether it's Mekadesh L'Lechem or not Kadesh L'Lechem, really boils down to the most basic, fundamental yesod in understanding Machshavas Pigel. Pigel isn't just a psul. There's a carbon pigel. And the pigel becomes carbon pigel ayidei dalad avodas, which means that by definition, a shchita with a machshav of chutz l'zmanoi is a shchita. Because if it wasn't a shchita, then the carbon wouldn't have dalad avodas. There'd be no way for it to be pigel. If it's a shchita, there's no reason that it shouldn't be able to be mekadesh alechem. Just to go down memory lane for a second, and that is, we always speak out to Chasam Sofer's kasha. Chasam Sofer brings in a tshuva that one of his talmidim asked him a kasha. The Gemara says in Masechtas Gittin, there's machlokes whether hezek she'enoi nikar shma hezek or lo shma hezek. There's mandama that says a hezek, even if you can't see the hezek, still it's shmei hezek. My nafkamina. So the Mishnah says a nafkamina would be kehanim shepigul kehanim nehanim machshavas pigul. They're going to have to now pay the bailam because the bailam's going to have to bring another carbon. They were mazik, even though it's enoi nikar, you don't see anything. They didn't physically cause any damage. But hezek sheni nikar shmei hezek, thus they're going to have to reimburse the bailam. So the Talmud asked the Chasam Sofer al-Charifos. He said that if the kohen did the avodah with a machshavas pigul, it comes out the avodah wasn't a real avodah. We know the Rambam Shita doesn't end the Filchas Kalayim that a kohen who is the big day kuna shloi b'shas avodah gets malchus because he's over the issa shatnez. The Kalayim had shatnez. The Avnei, he's over the issa leisil b'shatnez. If you're over shatnez, you're getting malchus. If you're getting malchus, you don't pay because we know kidei rishah soy mishim rishah achas atam mechayv v'atam mechayv mishum shei rishah. This is Elu Nairis 101. The first parak of Masechtas Makkos 101. You never like a mashav. So the Talmud asked the Chasam Sofer, I don't understand the whole sugi of hezek nicker, hezek shenei nicker. Kehanim shepiglu are going to be chayiv. If they were mefagel, it comes out they never did the avodah. If they never did the avodah, they were the big day kudish loy b'shas avodah. They're going to get malchus. Once they get malchus, they can't pay moment because they're any like in mishalim. So in the stencils they bring there, Reb Chaim said the kasha is a toys. He says why? Because when a kohen does the avodah with machshavas pigel, he is doing the avodah. Because if he wasn't doing the avodah, would it be pigel? Kartzos kacha kachartzos pasul. It has to have a teres avodah. Because if it doesn't have a teres avodah, it couldn't be pigel. If it's an avodah and a chanami, it's artzos pasul. Or artzos pasul is eich avodah. So when the Rambam says kayanim that we're the big day kudish loy b'shas avodah, means he wasn't doing an avodah at all. But to the extent that it's an avodah, albeit artzos pasul, a bad avodah. But at the end of the day, shma avodah, and being that it's an avodah, that's why the halacha is he's not going to be like. But again, it's this yisoy that the avodas that are done in a carbon pigel are avodas. Again, this is a good maramakim for this idea. The Mishnah had said shachta shaloi l'shma. If the shchita of the carbon toida was done shaloi l'shma, the chen, and then it gave other examples of a shlomim that comes together with breads, where the shchita was done shaloi l'shma, that the breads don't become kaddish. V'chein eil hamiluim, v'chein shnei kifzei atzera sheshachna shaloi l'shma kiddush loy kiddush. Meaning these halachas are not only true for the lachmei toida; it's true for other shlomims that come together with breads. What are two examples? Number one, eil hamilum. That's the shlomim that was brought in Rosh Chodesh Nisan by Hiba Yom Hashmini. And you have also the kifsei atzer. Straight to Gemara, Amar Papa, Shavak Tana, Didan, Ayol Nazar Shchiv, and Nakan Ayla Milum. You want to give examples of a shlavim that comes together with breads. So what's your example? The example is the Eil Hamilum. Eil Hamilum was a carbon that was brought one time. It was a one-time event. L'chayra, I have a much better case. Something that's actually shchiach. Ayol Nazar. The Zeros was shchiach once upon a time. So Shavak Tana Didan, Ayol Nazar, the shchiach. V'nakad ayil hamiluim, says Rapapa, the answer must be v'tana didan ikir milsa nakad. Being that was the first shlovim that ever came along together with bread, it was b'yem hakamas hamishkan. So as a result, the time of the Mishnah, but of course the halach in the Mishnah of shachtan shaloi l'shma like kiddush alechem is true for every ayil nazar as well. So the Mishnah is going to digress now, and it's going to go me'inyan le'inyan ba'usinyan. So we're talking about the relationship between the carbon toida and the lachmei toida, and this concept that if there was something wrong with the avodah that was done in the carbon toida, it would impact whether or not the lachmi toida become kaddish or don't become kaddish. Says the Mishnah. On that note, we know that there were many karbanos that came together with nesachim. There was a minchas nesachim, which was a carbon mincha. There was the yayin, the nischei yayin. Says the Mishnah, nesachim shekidshu b'kli. What happens if nesachim were neskadish b'kli? You put the nesachim, the mincha, the shemen, the yayin. It was all in a kli shares. And they found out afterwards that the zevach, the carbon that it came together with, was possible. If there's another zevach, then you can bring these nesachim together with another carbon. Ve'im lanu, that's the right gersa. If they had lina, they were out overnight, yifsulu belina, they're going to become possible. So the Gemara is going to explain this Mishnah. But the point is, you see right away a similarity. That just like the lachmi toida talui in a kosher or carbon toida, so too the nesachim are somehow talui in a kosher or carbon. The carbon that the nesachim come along with, that tuffle to the carbon. Therefore, a nesachim shekidshu b'kli, even if it had kedusha and a klisharis, but v'nimtze zevach pasol, there was something wrong with the zevach, that's somehow going to impact the laws of the nesachim. How exactly is it going to impact it? So zok the Gemara, iri, ein nesachim skatsh ala b'shchita zevach. Nesachim become kadosh ayidei shchita zevach. So just like the lachmi toida became kadosh ayidei the shchita of the carbon toida, so too the nesachim got their kedusha b'shchita nighttime. Amakra, the pasuk says zevach. So the entire pasuk is Elam Maya de Hashem Ashetik Roisim V'Kroi Kodesh Lahak Revishal Hashem Oilo Umincha Zevach Unesachim Tvaryoyim B'Yoyim. So the pasuk says Zevach Unesachim. What we learn from there is the Zvicha is what gives the Nesachim the Kedusha. Our Mishnah said Nesachim Shekidusha B'Kli V'Nimtze Zevach Pasol Im Yesh Zevach Achar Yikruvu Imoy V'Im Lav Yifsolu Belina. So the Mishnah said that if the Nesachim were Neskadash B'Kli, and now we found out that the Zevach was Pasol. So what's the halacha? If there's another Zevach, Yikruvu Imay, meaning the Nesachim don't become Pasol, you could take the Nesachim and bring it together with another carbon. Says the Gemara, my love, the Ifsal B'Shchita, isn't it talking about where the Psul happened in the Shchita, meaning there was never a kosher Shchita? So if there was never a kosher Shchita, then why are these Nesachim even Kaddish? Right, from the Mishnah, it's mashma the Nesachim HaKaddish. What does the Mishnah say? Either tag it along with another carbon, or if you don't have another carbon, it's going to end up being pasabalina. Both of these halachas suggest that it has kedusha. The fact that you need to stick it give it to another carbon, that means it has kedusha. Additionally, the fact that it's pasabalina means it has kedusha, because chulin doesn't become pasabalina. Only kachim becomes pasabalina. So says the Gemara that l'chayra, if we're talking about v'nimtza zevach pasal, and Zeiri said that if the zevach becomes pasal, if the shchita was pasul, it never got its kedusha. So what's the Mishnah? Why do you have to put it together with another zevach? Why would it become pasabalina? So the Gemara says, "My love the isla b'shchita." The Gemara says, "Like the isla b'srika." So there was a kosher shchita. There was a kosher shchita. When the Mishnah says v'nimtza zevach pasul, it means the psul happened after the shchita. It happened b'shas zrika. Says the Gemara, "Keman to Rebbe." Is this going according to Rebbe? The Amar Shnei Dvar Matirin Mailin Zebeloiza. So who's this Rebbe? So the Maseres Hasha sends you to Leil Daf Mem Zayin Menal. The topic was the Kifsei Atzeres, one of the most complicated Gemaras in Mesachtes Menachos. The zika between the Kifsei Atzeres and the Shtei Halechem. The halach is you need kosher avoidus in the Kifsei Atzeres in order to be mat to the Shtei Halechem. There was a machlokes over there between Rabbi and Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Shimon. When you say you need the avoida in the Kifsei Atzeres to be mat to the Shtei Halechem, does it mean the shchita and the zrika, or with shchita and without the zrika alone be enough? The Gemara is timing that l'chura the same shayla you have regarding the Kifsei Atzeres should relate to this sugi as well. Meaning, if you're telling me that the shchita is mekadesh the nesachim, according to Mandama that holds that the shchita and the zrika are mekadesh the kifsei atzeres, it's probably the shchita and the zrika that are mekadesh the nesachim as well. That machlokes Rebbe Lazar Bashim is probably not unique. It's probably not exclusive to the kifsei atzeres and the shtei halechem. It's probably true for all shlamim and that come to all karbanas that come together with something ancillary, with something tafel, such as a zevach and a nesachim. So the Gemara is tiny bishlam according to Rebbe that holds shnei dvarim hamatirim, the shchita and the zrika by the kifsei atzeres are mailin zebeloizer. So as long as he had a shchita ksheira, even if there was a psul in the zrika, it's already kadosh to nesachim. Thus the halachas of the Mishnah. Yesh zevach achar yakrivu imay, and if not, it's going to end up becoming pasabalina. The point is it's kadosh. But according to Rabbi Lazar Reb Shimon, that held in that sugya that you needed the shchita and the zrika of the kifsei atzeres to give the shtei halechem kedusha, then l'chayra it shouldn't work to tell me that it was ifsal b'zrika, because it was ifsal b'zrika. You need the shchita and the zrika to be mekadesh in the nesachim, just like you need the shchita and the zrika in the kifsei atzeres to be mekadesh the shtei halechem. So the halacha should weiter be that it's like Kiddush. Thus, The Gemara's kasha, why am yesh zevach imay yakrivo imay, and why am lav yifslu belina? Why should it be possible at all? The Gemara says, "Afilu temer laz b'Rav Shimon." No, hacham mayaskina going to keep al damam b'kais v'nishba. What happened was it became possible during the zrika, but there was a good shchita and there was even a good kabbalah. Who cares? It was a good kabbalah. The Zrika is what's matter together with the Shechita, not the Kabbalah. Rav Shimon he holds like his father. The Amar Kalaim Zarek Shimon Baichai holds that Kalaim Zarek Zarek Dam. You see, it's true. You need the Shechita and the Zrika, but once you do a Kabbalah, it's already oimit for Zrika. Thus, it says if you did Shechita and Zrika, as if you did Shechita and Zrika, that's enough already for it to be matter. Amar Yesh Zevach Achar Yakrivu Imay. Right to Gemara. Rav Chizda says again. We're talking about where you have a carbon that came together with Nesachim, and now the Zevach became possible. But it became possible after the Shechita, or after the Shechita and the Kabbalah. So the Nesachim were Niskadesh already, and now there's something wrong. So you can't bring the Nesachim anymore together with this carbon is possible. So if there's another carbon, bring it together with the other carbon. Freit the Gemara, how does it stem with something Rav Chizda once said? Rav Chizda said, Shemen shafrish l'shum mincha, zeh, possible l'shum mincha acheres, that if you set aside Shemen for a particular mincha, and then something happened to the mincha, you can't bring it with another mincha. So why then could you take these nesachim and bring it with another carbon? What's the difference between nesachim that's tuffle to a carbon, that if it was set aside for this carbon and then something happened to this carbon, you can bring it with another carbon, whereas the shemen that was set aside for one mincha and then something happens, you can't bring it with another mincha. Amar Rabbi Yanai, so Rabbi Yanai said, Lev Bezdin Masna Aleim. That Rav Chizda must have, that the pshat in our Mishnah is that Bezdin is Masna, and Bezdin must have made a Tanai L'Katchila. Bezdin said that like Katchila, when you're mafresh the nesachim, they're doing it all tonight. That if something's going to end up happening with the carbons, you're not going to be able to bring it together with this carbon. You'll bring it together with another carbon. So why would we assume that there's a leiv bezdin when it comes to nesachim? There's no leiv bezdin when it comes to the shemen. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you, shemen gufi the mincha. Because shemen is part of the mincha. I mean that it's part of the mincha, so it's different. Why is it part of the mincha? Because it's belula the mincha. And even though we're talking about where it was only set aside, the belila didn't happen yet, but it's oimed to be balul, and as a result, it's oimed labila, roy labila, and as a result, but the Gemara says, why didn't they make a different tonight? Why didn't they make a tonight that if they don't need the shemen, it should go l'chulin? I understand why, if it was set aside for this mincha, you can't go use it for another mincha. And the reason is because it's considered part of this mincha. But make a different tonight. Why don't you make a tonight that if you're not going to need it, can go l'chulin? Gemara says, we're afraid that people might think that you're allowed to take something for klisharis l'klicha. If you're worried about gzeres, so why do you make the gzer in our sugya? Why are you saying that the nesachim to be used for another carbon? Why aren't you worried that people are going to say that you could always do it? They're not going to realize all the information. The Gemara says, Matzio ben Yehuda already addressed that, because he said the only time it works is if there was a carbon sitting around. Meaning, you can tell right now. I mean, the innocent bystanders aren't going to realize that the nesachim were more miyuchid for this animal than they were for another animal. If it's going to be yotzel l'chulin, so that, the yotzel l'chulin, what happened? It was part of a carbon, now it's yotzel l'chulin. But if there's two carbonas, the nesachim were for this, and instead we end up using it for, if you let it wait for 5 hours, so again, maybe there is a gzeira. People are going to think that it's indiscreet. You could just go ahead and move nesachim from one carbon to another. But if it's zevach zevuch b'is hasha, there's no way any takol is going to come from this. So the Gemara says, "Aval ein zevach zevuch b'is hasha, my nifsal." But what happens if there's no zevach zevuch b'is hasha? Then it's going to be possible. Meaning, you're coming out now and you're telling me that the only time it works, in this case, you had a carbon and a sachin. Something happened to the carbon. After the shchita, after the Kabbalah, something possible happened to the carbon. So what do you do with the nesachim? If there's another zevach, right then and there, you can attach it to that. But if there's no zevach, zevuach, ba'is hasha, what's coming out is then there's nothing you can do with it. So it says, what did the Seifa say? That if there's no zevach, zevuach, if there's no other carbon to attach it to, it's going to end up being possible. If you want to give me a case of where it's possible, you could have given me another case. What was the Mishnah's case? The Mishnah's case, if it ends up being possibilina, then it's going to be possibilina. Really, this nesachim could be possible in much quicker if there's no zevach zavuach ba'is hashah. So why do we have to jump to where it was nifsal balina to present the case of where it became possible? If there was no zevach zavuach, it already became possible. So the Gemara says, "Achinami kama." That's the way you have to read the Mishnah. Medvar mamur shay zevach zavuach ba'is hashah, aval ein zevach zavuach ba'is hashah. Nasa kibisha nifsal balina psulim. So not if it became possible balina, it's possible, but rather if there was no zevach zavuach ba'is hashah, it's already nasa, and therefore it's going to be possible. The Gemara says, Isle lirab Shimon leiv bezdin masna aleim. So what came out is that pshat in our Mishnah that says anasachim shekitchu bekli v'nimtza zevach pasol im yesh zevach acher yakriv u'imay. What was that based on? It was based on a halacha of leiv bezdin masna aleim, meaning the fact that you're allowed to transfer it from carbon A to carbon B really shouldn't work. Rav Chizda said that you can't take the shemen that was set aside from one mincha and now attach it to another mincha. The only reason it works is because it's a leiv bezdin masna aleim. Mara's kasha is that Rav Shimon bar Yochai's shita is that there's no leiv bezdin masna aleim. It doesn't work, and as a result, how could the Gemara have said that this Mishnah stems of Rav Shimon? L'chayra, the Mishnah is predicated on leiv bezdin masna aleim. Rav Shimon doesn't hold leiv bezdin masna. Now, where does Rav Shimon not hold leiv bezdin masna aleim? That's the Gemara we're about to learn. But really, before we learn the Gemara, just to understand Pashut Pshat in the Gemara, it ties into something we've spoken about a few times recently. It's so agav, but at the same time, it's very profound. And that is, where does Rav Shimon? Where do you have Rav Shimon in today's daf? We didn't have Rav Shimon. I mean, the first part of daf, we had Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, we had Rabbi Akiva, we had Rabbi Meir, we had Rabbi Yehuda, we had all the Chachmei Yavna, all the Gedolei Atanon. Where do you have Rav Shimon? We had Rabbi Elazar Rav Shimon. And the Gemara said that Rabbi Elazar Rav Shimon, who holds ordinarily that with regards to the kivsei atzeres and the shtei halechem, that you need a good shchita and a good zrika in order to be mekadesh the shtei halechem. So l'chura, the same would be true as it relates to nesachim that come together with a carbon. And at first glance, the Gemara wasn't sure how to reconcile our Mishnah with Rabbi Elazar Rav Shimon, and the Gemara said you can make our Mishnah shtim with Rabbi Elazar Rav Shimon. How so? We'll say that Rabbi Elazar Rav Shimon holds like his father Rav Shimon, who holds koloiz made lizarik kizarik dami, so that although you need a shchita and a zrika to be mekadesh the shtei alechem with the kivsei atzeres, thus you need a shchita and a zrika to be mekadesh the nesachim that come together with a zevach. But as long as you did a shchita and a kabbalah, now it's oimeg lizarik, it's already kizarik dami. That would be enough to be mekadesh. So we said that Rabbi Elazar, the Mishnah could stim with Rabbi Elazar Rav Shimon. It's not a kasha Rabbi Elazar Rav Shimon. We can make it work as long as he holds like his father Rav Shimon bar Yochai. So you had Rav Shimon in the sugya, and that's l'chura Pashut Pshat in the Gemara. That you already had a Rav Shimon, but the Gemara says Rabbi Elazar Rav Shimon is going to hold like Rav Shimon. Kaloim lizarik kizarik dami. The problem is the Mishnah is predicated on leiv bezdin masna aleim, and Rav Shimon doesn't hold the leiv bezdin masna aleim. But kamufin, you're holding cheshbon. The Gemara, it's very tzarich the Gemara, because again, the Gemara is not Rav Shimon. The Gemara is Rabbi Elazar Rav Shimon. The Gemara just said Rabbi Elazar Rav Shimon would have to hold like Reb Shimon Kalaimid Lizarik Kazarik Dami. So okay, so he holds like Reb Shimon Kalaimid Lizarik Kazarik Dami, and he holds Leiv Bezdin Maslanayim, not like Reb Shimon Shita in these complicated sugyas who holds that you don't say Leiv Bezdin Maslanayim. It's Mavu in this Gemara again that to say that Reb Shimon would argue, Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon would argue Reb Shimon apparently was a big daichik to the Gemara. It's clear. That's what the Gemara is saying, because the Gemara knows we're not discussing Reb Shimon. The Gemara knows we're discussing Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon. And just because we used Reb Shimon to make the Mishnah work with Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon because of a whole different kasha, Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon Shita and Menachos Mem Zayin, it doesn't mean the Mishnah is Reb Shimon. The Mishnah is Rabbi. Who said the Mishnah is Reb Shimon? Terry says the Mishnah is Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon. But Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon was Reb Shimon's son. Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon was Reb Shimon's Talmud. And it's always a b'di'evet to assume that a Talmud argues with the Rebbe. It's a very big chiddush. Even though you find throughout Shas Talmidim arguing with Rebbe, you had it in today's daf. You have a Talmud arguing with the Rebbe. Rabba and Rava. Rabba was Rabba's Rebbe. And the Gemara has the right Chatos, Chutz Lizmani, Malu Yerd, Malu Yerd. Machlikas Rabba and Rava. Rabba was Rava's Rebbe, but they're allowed to argue. A Rebbe's allowed to argue with a Talmud. The Mechaber brings it, the Ramah brings it in Yeridei Sim and Reish Mem Beis. The Goyen says, Bekula Talmuda, Rebbe, Reb Shimon Gamliel, you find it throughout Shas. But one of these ideas that we've seen a few times recently, with Derech Agav, is that it's always a b'di'evet. The Chacham Tzvi, and Yud, etc. It's always a b'di'evet. It's not a l'katchila. Thus, to assume that Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon is not like Reb Shimon. It's a big daichik. So afraid the Gemara. How does me Islay the Reb Shimon lay bez and masla aleim? Who's talking about Reb Shimon? Nobody. We're talking about Reb Elazar Reb Shimon. But Reb Elazar Reb Shimon is the Chatalmud for Reb Shimon, and he's Reb Shimon Reichai's son. It's mistaber that he held like his father. So you wanted to make the Mishnah work with Reb Elazar Reb Shimon. You were able to address one point, but at the end of the day, if the Mishnah hinges on lay bez and masla aleim, Shimon Reichai doesn't hold the lay bez and masla. How do you know that? What happens if the leftover karbanos tamid, leftover animals, the divrei Rab Shimon ain't niftin tmimim, the divrei chachamim niftin tmidim. The chachamim hold is an eitzah. We've had this already. Chachamim say you could just be paid it. It's not a big deal. Rab Shimon says you can't be paid it. Why did the chachamim hold you can be paid it? Because leiv bezna masna, bezna makes a tanai, the chatchila, when they buy these animals, that if they're not going to need it, so it'll become chulin. Rab Shimon didn't hold leiv bezna masna aleim. If our Mishnah is predicated on leiv bezna masna aleim, obviously the Mishnah is Rab Shimon. That's the case. How could the Mishnah be Reb Elazar Reb Shimon? Says the Gemara, Shani Hasam, this lutakanta beriya. There's another eitzah. The eitzah is you could always be paid it. Those animals, let them get a mum, be paid to the animals, take the money, buy different karbanas. There's a way out. These nesachim, if there was no way to use it for another carbon, it would end up being possibilina. We don't want it to be possibilina. So does Reb Shimon hold they bezdin masleim or not? It depends. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. At the end of the day, this Mishnah could stem with Reb Shimon Shita, and as a result, the Mishnah could stem with Reb Elazar Reb Shimon.